Good afternoon, my fellow travelers. How are you today? Hope you're doing well in your part of the world. I appreciate the Lord and his goodness toward me. It's good to be saved this afternoon, and I'm thankful for God's gifts and his blessings. And I appreciate you being along for the ride today. Just it's Monday, obviously, September the 7th, I believe, 2020. And we continue on with the COVID virus and all the issues related to that. We've gone to a new phase here in North Carolina. We're at 2.5, whatever that means. And we're just moving along day by day. But I appreciate the Lord's faithfulness in all of this and his goodness. And I'm glad that one of these days we'll be past it and the world will be different. Things are going to change. They already have. And they will continue to be different for quite some time if, in fact, we ever go back to what normal used to be. But the fact is, it's good to be a child of God because God's faithful. And I'm glad that he is. So I was talking to a friend of mine last night, and we were talking about the issue of suffering. And I won't mention his name or what he's going through, but he's going through some hard times, and he's having a lot of difficulty, struggling with some issues. And so the question that formed in my mind as I talked to him was, how do we handle suffering? More specifically, how do you handle suffering? What do you do when the bottom falls out of your life? What do you do when trouble comes your way? What do you do when you're having difficulty living from even minute to minute? How do you do that? Well, I reflected as I thought about that on what the Apostle Paul said in 2 Corinthians 12, and you're familiar with that passage. It deals with Paul's thorn in the flesh. And beginning in verse number 7, Paul said this, "And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure." So Paul said, so many spiritual things were happening in my life. God was speaking direct revelation through me. I was seeing things no one else was seeing, and God was giving me this great load of revelation. He said there was a chance that I might be exalted in my flesh. I might begin to think of myself more highly than I should. And Paul said I was given a gift. And the gift was a messenger of Satan, which was sent to buffet him or to beat him into submission. Paul says, lest I should be exalted above measure. And apparently, whatever this thorn in the flesh was, and there's been a lot of speculation over it throughout the years, and nobody really knows. But Paul says in verse 8, "For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, 3 times, that it might depart from me." He said, I went to the Lord in prayer. I went to Jesus and I asked him 3 times to please take this away from me. Now, what was God's response to Paul? In verse 9, he said unto me, "My grace is sufficient for thee. For my strength is made perfect in weakness." So the Lord's response is, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. Now, I've heard this verse twisted a little bit where people will say, well, if someone dies, there's grace for that. If there's a financial issue, there's grace for that. If there's medical problems, there's grace for that. But that's not what the Lord said. He said, my grace is sufficient for you. I'm going to give you the grace you need in whatever you face in life. So God's grace is not sufficient for my need. God's grace is sufficient for me. It's a very personal thing. God gives sufficient grace for whatever you and I face in life, and he gives it to us that we might be strengthened. And then God says something very strange. He says, my strength is made perfect in weakness. How you like that? God said, Paul, I prefer you to be weak, because when you are weak, then I am stronger through you. And we would think the opposite would be true. We would think that when my intellect is the sharpest, when my skills are honed to perfection, when I'm doing everything the best way I can do them, then I would be a more powerful tool for God. But God says, I want you weak. I want you broken. I want you submissive. I want you to fall in line under me, because when you are in a state of weakness, then I am going to be seen as being stronger through you. How's that possible? Well, it's possible because people around us, they sense our weaknesses. As I talked to my friend last night, I sensed his weakness. I felt his frustration. I heard his anger as he talked about what he was dealing with. And I experienced that with him. I understand how he feels, at least as much as I can, given I've not been through his exact situation, but he is in a place of weakness right now. He is a broken man before the Lord. And in that state of weakness, God is able to use him in a greater way than he would be able to if my friend was at his best. So sometimes being weak is not a bad thing. Now, hearing this from the Lord, you might expect all kind of reactions from Paul. He might have looked at this and said, well, I don't want to be weak. I'd rather be strong. And hadn't we all rather be in a position of strength rather than weakness? But I love what Paul said. He said, most gladly, therefore, because his grace is sufficient and because God gets glory from my weakness, he says, most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities. He says, I'm going to boast about them. I'm not going to complain because I'm having to go through this. I'm not going to usher up all of this big litany of complaints against God for bringing this terrible thing on me. Instead, I'm going to glory in it. I'm going to boast about it. I'm going to say, thank God for sending me this thorn in the flesh so that I might be made weak, so that God might be seen to be strong. He said, I will rather glory in my infirmities. Why? That the power of Christ may rest upon me. Isn't that amazing? Paul said, when I'm at my weakest, God is at his strongest through me. Why is that? It is because I'm more dependent upon him. If all of my faculties are working as they should, if everything is going great in my life, if all the bills are paid and the needs are met, and I'm just, I'm a spiritual powerhouse and a mental powerhouse, and everything is functioning as I want it to, then I may be able to think I can do this on my own. But Paul said, I can't do this on my own. I'm a broken man. I need God's help. And he says, the power of Christ rests upon me when I am at my weakest. And thus he goes on and says, therefore, I take pleasure. I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. Paul said, I find great joy. I find happiness. I find pleasure in being weak. I find pleasure in people hating me. I find pleasure in having needs. I find pleasure when I'm attacked for my faith. I find pleasure when I'm pressed into tight places where I'm under great distress. Paul said, I see these things coming in my life, and I don't run away and hide. Instead, I run to them with open arms and say, yes, I'm going to be broken. Yes, I'm going to hurt. Yes, I'm going to have difficulty. But that is a good thing because God is going to get glory through my life. Now, let's just be honest and confess this. Most of us have not arrived at the place Paul had arrived at. Most of us are not willing to look at our problems and say, I take pleasure in this. I thank God for this. I'm going to literally boast about this. I'm going to say, praise God for bringing this on me because, hey, the power of God now rests upon me where before it didn't rest in such measure. But now that I'm weak, God is seen to be strong and he's getting glory through my weaknesses. I tell you, that's a tough place to get to. Most of us want to run away from our problems. We want to find a way out, and we're going to God daily, and we're praying, Father, get me out of this. I mean, take this away from me. Get this off of me. And God's looking at us and saying, hey, my grace is sufficient for you. Don't worry about this. Just rest in me, because my strength is made perfect through your weakness. But few of us have ever gotten to the place where we actually take pleasure in our infirmities, where we actually rejoice in having a difficult time. In fact, the word pleasure there means to think well of. So that's what Paul's saying. He said, when I think about everything that I've had to go through for Jesus, I think good about that. I think well about that. I look back upon the stoning. I look back upon the imprisonments. I look back upon the beatings. I look back upon all those times when I suffered for Jesus, and I think well of those occasions because they have made me the person I am today. Now stop and think about that. How much would you know about God if God had not let you walk through some hard places? I mean, I think back over my life, and I've learned more about God in the valleys than I ever have on the mountaintops, because it's in the valleys where I've been dependent upon Him, where I've needed help from the Lord, and I've sought that help, not from within myself because it's not there, but I've sought that help from Him. And that's what God does. He gives us the strength we need when we need it, as we need it, and in teaching us what God can do through our weaknesses, God reveals more of His personality, power, and character to us so that you and I are able to grow in grace. I mean, how in the world would Mary and Martha had ever learned that Jesus could raise the dead unless Lazarus had first died? They couldn't have. They couldn't have known that. And yet Lazarus got sick and died. They watched him waste away. They watched him die. They buried his body. And that was a tremendous time of weakness for them. And then Jesus shows up and he does what most people would consider impossible. He raises Lazarus from the dead, and he teaches them that not only is Jesus a great teacher, not only is he a great rabbi and a great friend, but he's also God who has the power to raise the dead. How would the disciples have ever known Jesus could protect them in a storm on the Sea of Galilee unless there had been a storm on the Sea of Galilee? How could the 20,000 have known that Jesus could feed them with 5 loaves and 2 fishes had there not been a need? How could Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have known that Jesus would meet them in the fire unless they had first been thrown into the fire? How would Daniel have known that God could shut the mouths of the lions so they didn't devour him had he not been cast into a lion's den? I think you get my point. Sometimes we have to be put in the low places so that God's strength may be seen in us and may be revealed to us so that we can learn more about Him. What a good and gracious God we serve. Now, Paul closes his thoughts by saying, he says, therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, reproaches, necessities, persecutions, and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. When I hit my point of ultimate weakness, then my position of ultimate spiritual strength is revealed, because God's grace works through me, giving me the strength I need to continue to stand for God when my human strength is gone. Isn't that a blessing that God would allow that for us? And some of that's come to fruition in your life during these days, I'm sure. You felt weaker than you ever have. You felt cut off. You felt estranged. You felt pressure. You felt stress, and you felt difficulty like you've not felt it before during this time of pandemic. And yet through it all, God has sustained you. God has helped you. God has grown you. God has matured you. And God has taught you more about Himself than had you not been through this. And so God knows what He's doing. What God is doing is recreating the image of Christ in every one of us. And to do that, God must first tear us down. He must first break us into our component parts and then rebuild us as He desires to. So God's weakness, or rather our weakness, translates into God's strength through us. So don't fight against what God's doing in your life. Rather, yield to it and trust God to have His way, and God will shelter you. He will keep you, and He will bless you, and He will take you through. So when you become weak, God's going to make you strong. When you face all the difficulties this life has to throw at you, lean on His strength and lean on His grace, because God will sustain you, and God will help you, and God will deliver you even through what you're going through. So I think about what Paul said. He said, I glory in my infirmities. I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses. So Paul said, it's not when I get out of it and look back that I thank God for it. It's when I'm in it. Paul said, right now, in the middle of it, this thorn in the flesh is killing me. I can't hardly take it, and yet I'm going to glory in it. I can't hardly stand all the things that are happening to me, yet I take pleasure in them while I'm going through them. It's in the valley that you and I learn the power of Almighty God. So I commend you to his care today, and I trust that you will walk with him through it. And that I trust that God will help you and sustain you and bless you and give you the strength you need day by day, hour by hour, that you might continue to walk with him and be the person God saved you to be. So let's yield ourselves to him. Let's trust him to know what he's doing, and let's commit our weaknesses to God, knowing that his strength will prevail. So thanks for listening to me today. I appreciate you doing that. Lord willing, I'll be back around tomorrow and we'll talk some more if God's willing to do that for us. In the meantime, you pray for me and I'll try to pray for you. And I appreciate you guys. Hang in there. I love you. We're going to get through this and God is going to help us and I'm glad he is. So have a good day and I'll talk to you tomorrow.